Here's what nobody tells you about finding your true mate. Sometimes the person the moon goddess chooses for you is the last person who will ever accept you. And when that person is an alpha king with a kingdom watching, your rejection becomes everyone's entertainment. The rejection was supposed to be handled quietly, perhaps a private conversation where Arya would gracefully accept Lucian's decision and return to her healing duties in the palace ward, invisible once more. But fate had other plans. Standing at the center of the Grand Hall during the Lunar Ascension Festival, surrounded by the most powerful wolves from every territory in the Northern Kingdom, Arya Moonstone felt the mate bond snap into place with violent intensity, a silver cord of pure energy connecting her heart to Alpha King Lucian Nightshades across the crowded room. If you're already hooked by this story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out. The sensation was unlike anything Arya had ever experienced. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to submit, to lower her gaze, to accept whatever the Alpha King decreed. The crystal chandeliers above cast fractured light across the marble floors, their glow reflecting off the ceremonial gold that adorned every pillar and archway. The scent of moonflower incense mixed with the electric tension radiating from hundreds of wolves, nobles in silk and jewels, visiting alphas with their battle-scarred frames, high-ranking betas, and their elegantly dressed mates. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation, as if everyone in the room could sense something monumental was about to happen. And there he was, Alpha King Lucian Nightshade, standing on the raised dais like he owned the very air they breathed. Which, technically, he did. His powerful frame was draped in the ceremonial black and silver armor of the royal bloodline, the kind that said, "I could kill you without breaking a sweat, but I'd rather make it a spectacle." His dark, wavy hair framed a face that looked carved from stone and shadow, all sharp angles, defined jawline, and those piercing ice-blue eyes that had haunted Arya since the moment their bond formed. The wolf insignia emblems on his chest caught the light as he moved, marking him as the apex predator in a room full of predators. He radiated authority, power, and something else Arya recognized all too well: contempt. Now, Arya knew exactly what she looked like to him, to all of them. A common Omega healer in a borrowed ceremonial gown, the red silk with its intricate gold embroidery that marked her as palace staff, not nobility. Her long dark hair fell in waves down her back, held in place by a simple silver circlet, because she had never learned the elaborate braiding styles favored by highborn she-wolves. Her hands, despite her frantic scrubbing that morning, still bore the faint herbal stains from years of preparing healing salves and tinctures. The dress, borrowed from a more optimistic Omega who believed the mate bond meant elevation rather than humiliation, fit well enough, but Arya felt the weight of every judgmental gaze, noting that she wore no family jewels, no ancestral markers, no symbols of status beyond the healer's red that marked her as useful, not worthy. She looked exactly like what she was, a servant who had been summoned to the grandest celebration of the year only to be publicly discarded. And everyone knew it. The crowd of nobles filled every available space in the vast hall, and let me tell you, they were loving this. They whispered behind ornate fans and gloved hands, their eyes glittering with the kind of anticipation you usually reserve for a really good scandal. Arya could feel their gazes like physical touches, assessing, dismissing, eagerly awaiting the show. This was history in the making, the kind of story that would be told and retold for generations. Remember that time the Alpha King rejected that Omega healer? What was her name again? Oh, it doesn't matter. She disappeared right after anyway. Lucian's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade through silk, clear, commanding, and absolutely frigid. "Let it be known to all assembled here on this sacred night of the lunar ascension," he declared, his words carrying to every corner of the hall, "that I, Lucian Nightshade, Alpha King of the Northern Territories and protector of the ancient bloodlines, reject the false bond the moon goddess has placed upon me." Arya's wolf howled inside her, a sound of pure anguish that she refused to let reach her face. The mate bond flared white-hot in her chest, burning like molten silver as if trying to convince them both that this was wrong, that they were meant to stand together, not apart. But Arya had learned something in her 5 years serving in the palace, watching nobles come and go, observing power in all its forms. What was meant to be, and what actually happened were two very different things. Destiny is beautiful in theory. In practice, it gets messy. Lucian continued, his words formal and rehearsed, each syllable carefully chosen for maximum impact. This Omega healer, born of the Moonstone line, a bloodline tainted by treason and stained with the crimes of those who sought to overthrow the rightful rule of my father, will never stand beside me as queen. Now here's where things get interesting. Those words, tainted by treason, that single phrase had defined Arya's entire existence, had kept her invisible and silent for years. But standing there, feeling the mate bond burn and twist inside her chest, while Lucian's ice-blue eyes bored into her with such absolute conviction, Arya made a choice that would change everything. She wasn't going to fade into obscurity. She wasn't going to bow her head and accept this fate quietly like every rejected Omega before her. Because Arya Moonstone knew something that Lucian and his carefully curated court did not. Her family weren't traitors. And the truth she had spent 5 years quietly uncovering while shelving books and brewing healing tonics was about to collide with the kingdom's most carefully guarded lies. But first, she had to survive. What came next? And trust me, what came next was going to shake this kingdom to its core. The silence that followed Arya's invocation of the reciprocal rejection decree lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the grand hall erupted into chaos. Nobles surged forward, their voices overlapping in disbelief and outrage. Visiting alphas leaned back in their seats with calculating expressions, suddenly very interested in what had seemed like routine entertainment. The elder council members rose from their ceremonial chairs, their ancient faces registering shock that anyone, let alone a common Omega, would invoke a law most believed had been forgotten centuries ago. But Lucian didn't move. He stood perfectly still on the dais, his ice-blue eyes locked on Arya with an intensity that made the mate bond flare painfully in her chest. For a moment, she saw something flicker across his face, surprise, perhaps even a hint of grudging respect, before it vanished beneath cold fury. Silence. His voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. The hall fell quiet immediately, hundreds of wolves responding to the alpha command embedded in that single word. Lucian descended the dais steps with predatory grace, each footfall deliberate and measured. The crowd parted before him automatically. He stopped mere feet from Arya, using his considerable height and presence to loom over her. The mate bond screamed at her to step closer, to seek comfort in his proximity. She locked her knees and held her ground. You invoke ancient law? Lucian's voice was soft now, dangerous. Very well. I accept your challenge, Omega. But understand this, the trial of worth will be conducted on my terms. He turned to address the assembled crowd, his voice ringing with authority. The reciprocal rejection decree states that a rejected mate may demand a trial of worth to prove their value to the kingdom. If they succeed, they are entitled to compensation and recognition. If they fail... He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. They are exiled permanently, their names stricken from all records, branded as one who challenged their betters and was found lacking. Arya's stomach dropped. She had memorized the decree's original wording during long nights in the palace archives, but there had been nothing about permanent exile for failure. Lucian was adding his own terms, reshaping ancient law to ensure her destruction. The trial will last 30 days. Lucian continued, his gaze never leaving Arya's face. In that time, you must complete 3 tasks that prove your worth to this kingdom. First, you will heal the Shadowfen Forest, land that has been cursed and barren for 15 years, where even our most powerful healers have failed. Second, you will negotiate peace with the Ironwood Pack, who have been raiding our borders for 2 decades and have killed 3 negotiators we've sent. Third, you will present evidence of a service so valuable, so essential to this kingdom, that it outweighs the treason your bloodline committed against the crown. The tasks were impossible. Everyone in the hall knew it. Arya could see it in their faces, the pitying looks from some, the satisfied smirks from others. Lucian had just sentenced her to failure wrapped in the illusion of a fair chance. The eldest member of the council, a silver-haired woman named Magistrate Celine, stepped forward. Her weathered face was grave. "The terms are harsh, Your Majesty. Perhaps." "The terms are within the bounds of ancient law," Lucian interrupted smoothly. "The challenged party sets the trials. The council's role is merely to witness and judge the results. Or have the laws changed without my knowledge, Magistrate?" Celine's jaw tightened, but she bowed her head. "The law is as you say. The council will witness the trial and render judgment on the 30th day." Lucian's smile was cold and sharp. "Excellent. Then let it be recorded that Arya Moonstone has 30 days to prove her worth or accept permanent exile." He turned back to Arya. "You will be stripped of your palace position immediately. A cottage on the kingdom's edge will be provided, along with basic supplies. You may not call upon palace resources or assistance. You stand or fall on your own merit, which, I suspect, will be revealed as non-existent." Arya felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, waiting to see if she would break, if she would beg for mercy or withdraw her challenge. The mate bond burned between them, and for just a moment, she sensed something beneath Lucian's cold exterior. A deep, buried conflict, a fear he wouldn't name. He wanted her to fail, needed her to fail, because if she succeeded, it would shatter everything he believed about bloodlines, worthiness, and the foundation of his entire rule. She lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. "I accept your terms, Alpha King. 30 days. 3 tasks. And when I succeed, you and this entire kingdom will learn what the Moonstone bloodline is truly worth." Something dangerous flashed in Lucian's eyes. "We shall see." He gestured to the guards stationed at the hall's perimeter. "Escort her out. She is no longer welcome in the palace." 2 guards moved forward, their hands gripping Arya's arms with just enough force to remind her she had no power here. As they turned her toward the massive doors, the crowd parted once more. Arya caught glimpses of faces as they passed, some filled with contempt, others with curiosity, and a few, surprisingly, with something that looked almost like hope. They led her through corridors she had walked for 5 years, past the healing ward where she'd spent countless hours tending to wolves who never learned her name, past the archives where she'd discovered the truth about her family hidden in forgotten texts. With each step, Arya felt her old life falling away like a shed skin. At the palace's side entrance, an elderly Omega woman was waiting with a small bundle of supplies. Arya recognized her, Mira, who worked in the kitchens and had always offered kind smiles when their paths crossed. The guards paused to allow Mira to hand over the bundle. "For your journey," Mira said softly, her weathered hands pressing the bundle into Arya's arms. As she did, Arya felt something small and hard tucked between the folded clothes. A note. Mira's eyes met hers for just a moment, conveying a message words couldn't. "You are not alone." Then she stepped back, and the guards pushed Arya forward into the cool night air. The cottage they'd assigned her sat on the very edge of the kingdom's boundaries, a small stone structure that had clearly been abandoned for years. The guards shoved her inside, deposited her meager supplies, and left without a word. The door closed with a finality that echoed in the empty space. Arya stood alone in the darkness, her borrowed red dress now feeling like a costume from someone else's life. Slowly, she opened the bundle Mira had given her, finding practical clothes, basic food, and the small folded note. By the light of the moon filtering through the cottage's single window, she read the words written in shaky handwriting. "Your family weren't traitors. Seek the scholar in the forgotten archives. He knows the truth." Arya's hands trembled as she clutched the note. 30 days to complete impossible tasks. 30 days to uncover a conspiracy that had been buried for 15 years. 30 days to transform from a discarded Omega into someone who could challenge a king. She looked out the window at the distant palace, its towers silhouetted against the night sky, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the mate bond this time, but something deeper, a determination forged from years of silence and suppression finally given voice. The trial had begun. and Arya Moonstone intended to win. Arya waited until dawn to leave the cottage, partly because navigating unfamiliar territory in darkness seemed foolish, but mostly because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The note had said to seek the scholar in the Forgotten Archives. Arya knew the main royal archives intimately. She'd spent 5 years shelving books and preparing healing reference texts there. But the Forgotten Archives were something else entirely, a crumbling building on the kingdom's outskirts that had been abandoned decades ago when the new archive wing was constructed. Most wolves believed it had been torn down. Apparently, they were wrong. The journey took her through sections of the kingdom she'd never seen, past the neat merchant quarters and tidy pack housing into areas where buildings sagged and streets narrowed. Wolves watched her pass with wary eyes, recognizing the healer's red she still wore, but sensing something had changed. News of her trial had already spread. In a kingdom built on gossip and hierarchy, scandal traveled faster than truth. The Forgotten Archives stood alone at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by overgrown weeds and the skeletal remains of what had once been a garden. The building itself was ancient stone, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. A lesser wolf would have assumed it was truly abandoned. But Arya had learned to notice things others missed, like the faint path worn through the weeds leading to a side entrance, or the way one window on the upper floor had glass that was suspiciously clean. She knocked on the side door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. "I know you're in there. Mira from the kitchen sent me. I need to speak with the scholar." Silence stretched so long Arya began to wonder if she'd made a mistake. Then a voice, rough with disuse and age, called from somewhere within. "Go away. Whatever you think you need, I don't have it." "My name is Arya Moonstone," she called back. "And I think you knew my mother." The silence that followed felt different, weighted with something heavier than mere refusal. After a long moment, she heard the scrape of multiple locks being undone. The door opened a crack, revealing a sliver of a man's face, weathered skin, gray beard, and one sharp eye that studied her with unnerving intensity. "Lena's daughter," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. "You have her eyes." And her dangerously poor sense of self-preservation. He pulled the door open wider. "Get inside before someone sees you." The interior of the archives was nothing like Arya expected. Where she'd imagined dust and decay, she found organized chaos. Shelves packed with books and scrolls, tables covered with documents and maps, candles providing warm light in the windowless central room. This wasn't an abandoned building. It was a functioning archive, hidden in plain sight. The man who'd let her in moved with a pronounced limp, his left leg dragging slightly as he led her deeper into the maze of shelves. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps 70, with the kind of wiry strength that comes from stubbornness rather than youth. "I'm Theron," he said without looking back. "And before you ask me whatever foolish questions you came here to ask, understand that the truth you're seeking will get you killed. Just like it killed your mother, your father, and everyone else who carried the Moonstone name." "The trial Lucian set for me will kill me anyway," Arya replied. "At least if I'm going to die, I'd like to know why my family was murdered." Theron stopped walking. He turned to face her fully, and Arya saw the deep lines of chronic pain etched around his eyes and mouth. "So, you know it was murder. That's more than most. Sit." He gestured to a worn chair at one of the tables. "But don't expect me to hand you the answers that will save you. I've kept myself alive by staying invisible. I won't throw that away for anyone, regardless of whose daughter they are." As he moved to take the chair opposite her, Arya saw him wince, a sharp, involuntary reaction that spoke of pain so constant he'd almost learned to hide it. Without thinking, she reached out with her empathic senses, the gift all Moonstone healers possessed. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. His left leg was a mass of old damage, bones that had healed incorrectly after a severe break, nerve pathways firing constant distress signals. But worse was the deeper injury in his spine, a compression that sent waves of agony through his entire body with every movement. "You're in pain," she said softly. "Constantly. Have been for years." Theron's expression hardened. "I don't need your pity, girl. I've managed this long without. He stopped mid-sentence as Arya extended her hand, not touching him but letting her healing energy flow outward. It was a technique her mother had taught her before she died, one of the few memories Arya still carried clearly. You didn't always need physical contact to ease suffering. Sometimes presence was enough. The change in Theron's face was immediate. His eyes widened as the chronic pain that had been his constant companion for over a decade began to fade. Not disappear. Arya wasn't strong enough for that yet, and some damage was too old to fully reverse. But enough. Enough that he could take a breath without bracing against agony. Enough that his shoulders dropped from their defensive hunch. Enough that tears gathered at the corners of his eyes. "Moon Goddess," he whispered. That's the Moonstone gift. I haven't felt that in 15 years. Arya withdrew her energy gently, leaving behind only a residual warmth that would last a few hours. My mother taught me before she died. I've kept it hidden all these years, using only the basic healing anyone can learn. But you needed it. And I need you to trust me. Theron stared at her for a long moment, then slowly, painfully, he began to laugh. It was a rusty sound, like a mechanism too long and used. Trust. Your mother said the same thing to me, right before she asked me to hide evidence that would destroy the kingdom's ruling family. He stood, moving with visible relief toward a shelf in the back corner. I was the royal historian. Did you know that? I documented everything. Births, deaths, treaties, wars. I had access to records no one else saw, files that were supposed to remain secret for generations. He pulled down a wooden box, worn smooth with age and handling. 5 years before your family was killed, I noticed something strange. The kingdom's overall health was declining. Not dramatically, nothing that would cause alarm. But incrementally, year after year, wolves were getting weaker, sicker, dying younger. I started investigating. What I found. He paused, his hands trembling slightly on the box. The previous Alpha King, Lucian's father Aldrich, had been systematically poisoning the kingdom's water sources. Arya felt the world tilt slightly. Poisoning his own people? Not enough to kill quickly, Theron said, opening the box to reveal stacks of documents. Just enough to keep them dependent. Weak wolves are loyal wolves. They need their alpha's protection, his strength, his resources. They don't question. They don't rebel. Aldrich discovered that a population living in constant low-level crisis will accept any authority that promises security. He spread several documents across the table, water test results, medical records, orders bearing the royal seal. The Moonstone healers discovered it by accident. They were treating an outbreak of weakness in the Southern Territories and traced it back to contaminated wells. Your mother brought the evidence to me, asked me to verify it through the historical records. I did. And what we found was a conspiracy that went back 3 generations of Nightshade rule. They were going to expose it, Arya said, pieces falling into place. My family was going to reveal what the royal family had been doing. They were whistleblowers, Theron confirmed. And Aldrich couldn't allow that. So he struck first. Massacred the entire Moonstone bloodline in a single night, then rewrote history. He branded them as traitors attempting to overthrow the crown, conspirators who'd been caught before they could poison the king. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so tragic. Why didn't you come forward? Arya asked, though she already knew the answer. Because I'm a coward, Theron said simply. Aldrich's guards found me the night after the massacre. They broke my leg in 3 places, crushed 2 vertebrae in my spine, and told me that if I ever spoke about what I knew, they'd finish the job. I've spent 15 years hiding in this forgotten building, keeping your family's evidence safe, but lacking the courage to use it. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but the truth is I was just waiting to die without having to face what I'd failed to do. He looked at Arya, and she saw something fragile and desperate in his eyes. Your mother died protecting this evidence, and I've let her death mean nothing. So no, girl, I won't help you. Not because I don't want to, but because I've already proven I'm not brave enough to stand against the Nightshade family. Go. Take your 30 days and try to survive them. Leave an old man to his cowardice. Arya stood slowly, her mind racing with everything she'd learned. The poison water. The manufactured weakness. The systematic corruption spanning generations. And Lucian, did he know? Was he continuing his father's legacy, or was he an unwitting heir to a poisoned throne? She looked at the documents spread across the table, evidence that could shatter a kingdom. Then she looked at Theron, broken and afraid but still breathing, still keeping the truth alive in his own way. "You're not a coward," she said quietly. "You're a survivor. And you've kept this evidence safe for 15 years, waiting for someone who could actually use it. Well, here I am. My family's legacy, walking into your archives." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I'll come back tomorrow. And the day after. And every day until my trial ends. You don't have to be brave enough for both of us. You just have to teach me how to use what my family died protecting." She left before he could respond, stepping back into the morning light with her world completely transformed. 30 days suddenly felt less like a death sentence and more like the exact amount of time needed to expose a kingdom's darkest secret. Arya returned to the forgotten archives at dawn, as promised. This time, Theron was waiting for her, the door already unlocked. He didn't say anything about her speech from the previous day, and she didn't ask. Some truths needed time to settle before they could be acknowledged. "If you're going to survive this trial," he said instead, leading her to a cleared space in the back of the archives where moonlight filtered through a cleverly positioned skylight, "you need to understand what you actually are. The Moonstone gift isn't just empathic healing. It's the ability to sense and purify corruption at its source. Your ancestors were the kingdom's first line of defense against poison, disease, and decay. They could feel wrong things in the environment before anyone else noticed. That's why Aldrich had to eliminate them. They were the only ones who could detect what he was doing." He gestured for her to sit in the circle of moonlight. "But your power has been suppressed for years. Partly by your own fear of drawing attention, partly by living in an environment saturated with low-level toxins. Every breath you've taken in this kingdom has been slightly poisoned. For most wolves, it's manageable. For someone with moonstone sensitivity, it's been slowly suffocating your abilities since childhood." Arya settled onto the cold floor, feeling the moonlight on her skin like a physical touch. "How do I awaken it?" "Painfully," Theron replied with grim honesty. "The moon's energy is pure, undiluted. When you open yourself to it fully, it will flood your system and purge the accumulated toxins. Your body will fight it because it's become accustomed to operating in a poisoned state. You'll feel like you're dying. But if you survive the purge, your true abilities will emerge." Over the next week, Theron put Arya through training that redefined her understanding of pain. He taught her to meditate under the open sky at night, drawing lunar energy into her body until her veins felt like they were filled with liquid silver. He made her practice sensing toxins in plants, water, even the air itself, learning to differentiate between natural decay and manufactured poison. And every night, the purging process left her retching and shaking as her body expelled years of accumulated contamination. "Your mother could purify an entire village's water supply with a single touch," Theron told her on the 5th night, as Arya lay exhausted on the archive floor. She could sense poison in concentrations so small our best alchemists couldn't detect it. That's the power sleeping inside you. But power without control is just destruction waiting to happen. By day 10 of her trial, Arya felt different. Her senses had sharpened to an almost painful degree. She could smell the faint chemical tang in the kingdom's water from miles away. She could feel the wrongness in the soil beneath her feet, a constant low-grade nausea that came from walking on poisoned ground. And the mate bond with Lucian, which she'd been trying to ignore, had become impossible to block out. She could sense him in the palace, feel his mood shifting between anger and something else she couldn't quite identify, doubt, perhaps, or conflict he refused to acknowledge. "You're ready," Theron announced on the 11th night. "Or as ready as you'll ever be in the time we have. Tomorrow, we go to Shadowfen Forest." The forest stood at the northern edge of the kingdom, a sprawling darkness that had once been lush and vital. Now it was a wasteland. Dead trees reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The ground was cracked and gray, nothing growing, nothing living. Arya had heard stories about Shadowfen her entire life, how it had been cursed by dark magic, how even the most powerful healers couldn't restore it, how wolves who ventured too deep sometimes didn't return. Standing at its edge at midnight with Theron beside her, Arya understood immediately why all previous attempts had failed. The forest wasn't cursed. It was poisoned. Massively, systematically poisoned. She could feel it in the air, taste it on her tongue, the same chemical signature she'd learned to recognize in the kingdom's water, but concentrated here to lethal levels. "This is where they dumped the excess poison," she said, horror dawning. "When the contamination of the water sources produced too much residue, they brought it here. They've been using Shadowfen as a disposal site for decades." Theron nodded grimly. "Your mother suspected as much, but we could never prove it." The forest became a convenient tragedy, a reminder that some wounds are beyond healing, that the kingdom needs strong leadership to protect it from mysterious threats. When in reality, the leadership created the threat. Arya stepped forward, feeling the poisoned ground resist her presence, like a living thing. Her empathic senses screamed in protest, every cell in her body recognizing the danger. But this was her first trial task. Heal Shadowfen or fail. Expose the truth, or let it remain buried with her family. She knelt on the dead earth and placed her palms flat against the cracked soil. Then she opened herself to the lunar energy overhead, drawing it down through her body and into the ground beneath her hands. The response was immediate and catastrophic. The poison in the soil recognized her power as a threat and attacked. Toxins that had been dormant for years surged upward, flowing into her body through her connection to the earth. Arya gasped as corruption flooded her system, not the low-level contamination she'd been purging for days, but concentrated poison designed to kill. Her healing power tried to purify it, but there was too much. For every molecule she cleansed, 10 more invaded. Her vision blurred. Her heart stuttered. The mate bond flared wildly as if Lucian, miles away in the palace, could sense her dying. Hands grabbed her shoulders, yanking her backward. Theron's voice cut through the roaring in her ears. "Break the connection." Arya let go. She couldn't. Her power had latched onto the poison like a wolf's jaws on prey, refusing to release even as it destroyed her. Everything her mother had died protecting, every truth that needed exposing, all of it was locked in this poisoned earth. If she let go now, she'd never have the strength to try again. Theron hit her, a sharp, stinging slap across her face that shocked her enough to break her concentration. Her hands lifted from the soil, and the connection severed. Arya collapsed backward, her body convulsing as it tried to expel the poison she'd absorbed. She was dimly aware of Theron forcing something into her mouth, an antidote, one of the emergency remedies he'd made her carry. Then darkness claimed her. She woke in the forgotten archives, weak and shaking. Theron sat nearby, looking older than his 70 years. "You nearly died," he said flatly. "Another 30 seconds and the toxins would have stopped your heart." "I could feel it," Arya whispered. "The poison. It's alive somehow. Aware. It fought back." "Poison that concentrated develops a kind of resonance," Theron explained. "It wants to persist, to spread. Fighting it directly is useless. You can't overpower it with brute force, no matter how much lunar energy you channel." Arya struggled to sit up, frustration and fear warring in her chest. "Then how am I supposed to heal Shadowfen? I have 20 days left, and I can't even purify a square foot of soil without nearly killing myself." Theron was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "You're approaching this wrong. You're trying to heal the land while you're still poisoned yourself. I've been purging for days." "Not your body," Theron interrupted. "Your spirit. Your sense of self. You've spent your entire life carrying shame that doesn't belong to you. The kingdom branded your family as traitors, and some part of you believed it. You've been making yourself small, invisible, unworthy. That shame is its own kind of poison, and it's blocking your true power just as surely as any chemical toxin." Arya felt the words hit like physical blows. She thought about the borrowed dress she'd worn to the rejection ceremony, The way she'd scrubbed her hands raw, trying to erase the stains that marked her as working class, how she'd spent 5 years being useful and unthreatening, believing that service might somehow earn her worthiness. Your mother didn't die a traitor, Theron continued softly. She died a hero, protecting truth at the cost of everything. Your father, your grandparents, every Moonstone who was murdered that night, they were heroes. And you are their legacy. Until you believe that, truly believe it in every cell of your body, you'll never access your full power. You can't heal corruption in the world until you heal the corruption in how you see yourself. Arya looked down at her hands, still stained with dirt from Shadowfen's poisoned soil. Her mother's hands. A healer's hands. A hero's hands. Not the hands of someone who needed to earn the right to exist, but someone who had inherited a legacy of courage and sacrifice. How do I heal that? She asked. How do I stop carrying shame I've carried my entire life? The same way you heal anything else, Theron replied. By acknowledging the wound, understanding its source, and choosing to let it go. You have 20 days. I suggest you start tonight. That night, under the full moon streaming through the archive skylight, Arya began the hardest healing work she'd ever attempted. Not purging toxins from her body, but releasing the toxic belief that she was anything less than worthy. It was brutal work, facing every moment she'd made herself small, every time she'd accepted someone else's judgment of her worth. But with each memory acknowledged and released, she felt something shift inside her. The mate bond with Lucian, which had been a source of pain and confusion, began to feel different, less like a chain binding her to someone who rejected her, and more like a connection she could choose to honor or sever on her own terms. By dawn, Arya was exhausted but fundamentally changed. She understood now what needed to happen. She couldn't heal Shadowfen by fighting the poison. She had to transform it, the same way she was transforming herself, by refusing to let corruption define the ground it occupied. 20 days left. 3 impossible tasks. And for the first time since the trial began, Arya believed she might actually survive them. On day 12, Arya returned to Shadowfen Forest with Theron's words echoing in her mind. Transform, don't fight. She approached the poisoned ground differently this time, not as an enemy to conquer, but as a wounded thing that needed gentle, persistent care. She worked at the forest's edge, where the contamination was least concentrated, marking out a small section no larger than a market stall. Then she knelt and pressed her palms to the earth, but instead of flooding it with lunar energy, she simply listened, felt the poison's resonance, its particular frequency, understood how it had woven itself into the soil's structure over decades of accumulation. Then she began to sing. Not words exactly, but a low, humming frequency that Theron had taught her, a moonstone healing technique so old it predated written language. The sound vibrated through her body and into the ground, creating a resonance that matched the poison's frequency, but at a slightly different phase. The two vibrations met, clashed, and began to cancel each other out. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of maintaining the frequency, of channeling just enough lunar energy to support the transformation without triggering the poison's defensive response. Arya's throat was raw, and her body ached by the time she felt the shift, the moment when contaminated soil began to remember what it had been before corruption claimed it. She pulled her hands back and opened her eyes. In the space where dead gray earth had been, green shoots were emerging. Small, fragile things, but undeniably alive. And where her palms had rested, a single silver-white flower bloomed, its petals catching the morning light like a promise. Arya returned the next day and expanded her circle. Then the day after that, and the day after that. Each session left her exhausted but exhilarated. The flowers that bloomed in her wake became her signature moon blooms, the common wolves started calling them, flowers that hadn't grown in the kingdom for over a decade. By day 16, she had cleared a visible path into Shadowfen's darkness, a ribbon of silver-white flowers marking where death had transformed back into life. Word spread faster than she expected. By the 3rd day of her work, she looked up from her ritual to find a small crowd gathered at the forest's edge. Farmers, merchants, low-ranking pack members who'd heard rumors that something impossible was happening. They watched in silence as she worked, and when the flowers bloomed, some of them wept. An elderly woman approached as Arya was packing up her supplies on day 17. "My grandmother told me stories about moon blooms," she said, her weathered hands trembling as she touched one of the silver petals. "Said they used to grow everywhere, that their roots purified the water, and their scent kept disease away. I never thought I'd see one before I died. The Moonstone healers cultivated them," Arya explained quietly, "before they were killed." The woman's eyes sharpened with understanding. "Before they were murdered, you mean? For discovering things powerful people wanted hidden." She squeezed Arya's hand. "My daughter has been sick for 2 years. Weakness, the palace healers called it. Nothing to be done. But I've lived long enough to recognize poison when I see it, even if it's delivered slow and steady." She leaned closer. "Whatever you're trying to prove with this trial, girl, you've got more people hoping you succeed than you know. Be careful. Hope is dangerous to those who profit from despair." That night, Arya returned to her cottage bone-tired but satisfied. 18 days remained, and she was actually succeeding at the first impossible task. The crowds gathering to watch had grown daily, not just curious onlookers anymore, but wolves who brought their sick children to breathe the purified air, who collected fallen moonbloom petals to steep in water for relief from mysterious ailments. She was healing more than just land. She was giving the kingdom proof that their weakness wasn't natural or inevitable. She'd just finished washing the dirt from her hands when her empathic senses screamed warning. Someone was approaching the cottage, moving with predatory stealth. Their intent felt like a blade against her awareness. Sharp, focused, lethal. Arya dropped to the floor just as the cottage's single window exploded inward. A crossbow bolt buried itself in the wall where her head had been moments before. She rolled toward the fireplace, grabbing the iron poker as her only weapon, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door burst open. A man entered, tall and muscled, dressed in dark leather that would have made him invisible in the night. His face was covered, but Arya's empathic abilities painted her a clear picture: trained warrior, no hesitation, no mercy. And on his leather vest, barely visible in the firelight, was an embroidered wolf insignia, the Nightshade family crest. "Nothing personal," he said, drawing a wicked-looking blade. "Orders are orders." He lunged. Arya swung the poker in a wild arc that he dodged easily. His blade sliced toward her throat. She ducked, using her smaller size to her advantage, and scrambled toward the door. He was faster, cutting off her escape. His blade caught her arm, a burning line of pain that made her gasp. But the moment his blade drew blood, Arya felt something she hadn't expected: the poison coating the weapon. Not enough to kill instantly, but a paralytic toxin designed to immobilize prey. The same chemical signature she'd been purging from Shadowfen's soil for days. She knew this poison intimately now, knew its frequency and resonance. As the toxin entered her bloodstream, Arya didn't fight it. She welcomed it, drew it deeper, then channeled the purification technique she'd been practicing. The poison met her lunar-charged blood and dissolved. The assassin's eyes widened behind his mask as she straightened, the expected paralysis failing to manifest. "Impossible," he breathed. "That dose should have dropped you in seconds." Arya pressed her advantage, extending her empathic senses not to read him, but to overwhelm him. She projected every ounce of pain and exhaustion she'd absorbed from Shadowfen's poisoned earth directly into his nervous system. He staggered, his blade clattering to the floor as phantom agony drove him to his knees. She grabbed the fallen blade and pressed it to his throat, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "Who sent you?" "Say Lucian ordered this." The assassin laughed, a choked sound. "The king doesn't dirty his hands with direct orders. But his council knows what he wants. An Omega healer stirring up the common wolves, making them remember flowers that used to bloom and strength they used to have? That's dangerous. Better you disappear now, quietly, than succeed in your trial and force him to acknowledge what you're proving. Which is that the kingdom's weakness isn't natural, that someone has been keeping them sick and dependent for decades." He met her eyes. "You're not just healing a forest girl. You're exposing a conspiracy. And dead women expose nothing. Arya increased the pressure of the blade slightly. Does Lucian know? About the poisoning, about what his father did. Something flickered in the assassin's expression. Genuine uncertainty. If he does, he's never acknowledged it. But ignorance is its own kind of choice, isn't it? When you benefit from evil, pretending not to see it is the same as participating. She should have killed him. He'd come to murder her, and he'd try again if she let him leave. But Arya had spent the past week learning to transform corruption rather than simply destroy it. Go, she said, stepping back and releasing her empathic assault. Tell whoever sent you that poison doesn't work on me anymore. Tell them the Moonstone bloodline isn't as easy to eliminate as they thought. And tell them that if they come for me again, I won't be merciful next time. The assassin stared at her for a long moment, then grabbed his blade and fled into the night. Arya slammed the door behind him and slid down to sit on the floor, delayed shock finally hitting. Her arm throbbed where he'd cut her, though the wound was already beginning to close, her enhanced healing kicking in. The Nightshade crest. An assassin bearing the royal family's symbol had tried to kill her, which meant Lucian, or at minimum his loyalists, had never intended for her to complete the trial. The impossible tasks weren't a test. They were a cover story for her inevitable disappearance. Arya looked at her blood-stained hands and felt something shift in her chest. The mate bond pulsed with Lucian's distant presence, and for the first time, she felt something other than pain or confusion flowing through it. She felt anger. Clean, focused, righteous anger at a system so corrupt it would rather murder truth-tellers than face its own crimes. 18 days left. One task proving successful enough that they'd tried to kill her to stop it. 2 more impossible challenges ahead. And now the certainty that she was fighting not just for her own survival, but against a kingdom built on systematic oppression. She stood, wrapped her bleeding arm, and began planning. If they wanted her dead, she'd make sure her death, or her victory, would mean something. The moonblooms would keep spreading through Shadowfen. The common wolves would keep gathering. And the truth her family had died protecting would finally see daylight. One way or another, this trial was going to change everything. With 15 days remaining on her trial, Arya stood at the edge of the Ironwood territory, staring at the warning markers, wolf skulls mounted on posts, their empty eye sockets a clear message to outsiders. Beyond them lay miles of contested borderland where 3 previous royal negotiators had been found dead, their bodies returned with notes that read simply, "Stay out." Theron had argued against this task, insisting she focus on completing Shadowfen's healing first. But Arya understood something he didn't. Time was no longer her only enemy. The assassination attempt had proven that Lucian's loyalists would keep trying to eliminate her. She needed allies, witnesses, people who could carry the truth forward if she didn't survive. The Ironwood Pack, outcasts and enemies of the Nightshade Crown, might be exactly that. She stepped past the skull markers, deliberately making noise so they'd hear her coming. Ambushing an already hostile pack seemed counterproductive to survival. Within minutes, she was surrounded, 6 wolves in their animal forms, circling with lips pulled back to show teeth. The largest, a massive gray wolf with scars crossing his muzzle, shifted to human form. "Lost, little Omega?" His voice was rough, almost amused. "Or suicidal?" "Neither," Arya replied, keeping her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. "I'm here to negotiate peace. My name is Arya Moonstone, and I need to speak with your alpha." The scarred wolf's expression shifted from amusement to sharp interest. "Moonstone. That's a dead bloodline." "Not entirely dead," Arya said. "And I have information about why your pack has been raiding our borders. Information that might make you reconsider who your real enemy is." They debated killing her right there. She could sense it in their postures, their exchanged glances. But curiosity won out over hostility. They escorted her deeper into Ironwood territory, through forests that should have been lush, but showed signs of the same sickness plaguing the kingdom. Discolored leaves, sparse undergrowth, an absence of smaller prey animals that should have been abundant. The Ironwood settlement was smaller than she expected, perhaps 200 wolves living in a collection of rough cabins and communal buildings. What struck her immediately was how many looked sick, thin frames, dull eyes, the kind of weakness she'd seen throughout the kingdom but more concentrated here. Children who should have been playing sat listlessly in doorways. Adults moved with the careful conservation of energy that came from chronic exhaustion. The Alpha's dwelling stood at the settlement center. They brought her inside where a woman waited, tall and rangy with iron-gray hair and eyes that assessed Arya with predatory intelligence. Alpha Kira of the Ironwood Pack looked exactly like someone who'd been leading desperate wolves for 2 decades, hard, pragmatic, and utterly without illusions. "The Royal Omega," Kira said flatly. "Come to negotiate peace with the barbarians raiding your civilized borders. Let me save you time, no. We reject your peace, your terms, and your king. You can leave now or die here. Your choice." Arya didn't move. Instead, she extended her empathic senses, carefully, gently. What she felt made her chest tighten with recognition. Kira wasn't just hostile, she was in pain. Constant, grinding pain that went beyond physical. The pain of watching her pack slowly die and being powerless to stop it. "Your water sources are poisoned," Arya said quietly. "That's why your pack is weak. That's why you've been raiding, not for territory or dominance, but for resources. Clean water, unpoisoned food. You're trying to keep your people alive." Kira's expression went dangerously still. "How do you know that?" "Because the same thing has been done to the kingdom. Systematically, deliberately, for decades." Arya stepped forward, ignoring the growls from the guards flanking Kira. "The previous Alpha King, Lucian's father, poisoned the water sources to keep the population weak and dependent. My family discovered it 15 years ago. They were massacred for trying to expose the truth. I've been working with a historian who has evidence, documents, water samples, medical records proving the conspiracy." "Why should I believe you?" Kira demanded. "Why should I trust anything coming from a wolf wearing the kingdom's colors?" "Because I can prove it." Arya pulled a small vial from her pocket, water she'd purified from Shadowfen, infused with dissolved moonloom petals. "This is what clean water looks like. Water that hasn't been contaminated. Taste it. Your body will recognize the difference immediately." Kira took the vial suspiciously, uncorked it, and took a small sip. Her eyes widened. She took another drink, larger this time than another. When she lowered the vial, something raw and desperate had entered her expression. "Moon Goddess. I'd forgotten water could taste like this. Like nothing. No metallic edge, no slight bitterness. Just water. The contamination is so gradual that wolves born into it don't realize they're being poisoned," Arya explained. "It becomes normal. But your body knows. It's been fighting the toxins your entire life, using energy that should go to strength, to healing, to living. That's why your pack is weak. Not because you're inferior or cursed, because you've been systematically poisoned." Kira sank into her chair, still clutching the vial. "The raids. We've lost so many wolves trying to steal resources from your borders. I've sent mothers and fathers to die stealing what we needed to survive. And all along, it was because..." Her hands trembled. "That bastard king poisoned us deliberately?" "He poisoned everyone," Arya said. "But your territory, being borderland and less monitored, probably received higher concentrations. Disposal site for excess contamination would be my guess. You've been the kingdom's dumping ground." The Alpha's grief transformed into rage, so quickly Arya felt it like a physical wave. Kira surged to her feet. "Then we go to war. We march on that palace and burn it to the ground with everyone bearing the Nightshade name inside it. Or," Arya said carefully, "you help me expose the truth legally, publicly, in a way that can't be dismissed or covered up. I'm in the middle of a trial of worth. If I succeed, I stand before the Elder Council and the assembled kingdom on day 30. That's a platform with witnesses, with legal authority. If I bring proof of the poisoning, testimony from affected wolves outside the kingdom's propaganda reach, I can force them to acknowledge what's been done." Kira studied her with new intensity. "What do you want from us?" Peace with the kingdom in exchange for me healing your water sources. I've learned how to purify the contamination. It's how I've been restoring Shadowfen Forest. I can do the same for your territory. And I need your pack to testify at my trial about when the poisoning began, how long it's affected you, what it's cost your people. Truth, backed by witnesses who have no reason to lie for the royal family. You're asking us to trust that you'll survive the next 15 days, Kira pointed out. To gamble our pack's future on one Omega's trial. I'm asking you to gamble on justice, Arya countered. Because the alternative is more decades of poisoning, more generations of weakness, more raiders dying for resources that should never have been denied in the first place. Someone has to break this cycle. I'm trying. Help me. The silence stretched. Then Kira looked at the vial in her hands, at the clear water that tasted like it should. My mother led this pack before me, she said finally. I watched her waste away from a sickness no healer could name. I was 23 when I became Alpha, too young and unprepared, because she died at 48 looking 70. My daughter is starting to show the same symptoms now. The same weakness, the same grinding exhaustion. Her voice cracked. If there's even a chance you're right, that this can be fixed, that she doesn't have to die young like her grandmother, then help me prove it, Arya said softly. Kira nodded slowly. You heal our water sources. Prove you can do what you claim. In exchange, we cease all raids immediately and provide testimony at your trial. We'll send a delegation, wolves who've lived through decades of this poisoning, who can speak to when it started and how it's destroyed us. If you fail, she met Arya's eyes. If you fail, we go back to raiding. Because at least that's action, even if it's desperate and futile. I won't fail, Arya promised, praying she could keep it. She spent the next 3 days working on Ironwood's primary water source, a spring that should have been crystal clear but ran with a faint chemical sheen. The process was similar to healing Shadowfen, patient, methodical purification using lunar energy and moonstone frequencies. By the 3rd day, the spring ran clean, and moon blooms had begun to sprout along its banks. The change in the Ironwood wolves was immediate. Within hours of drinking unpoisoned water, color returned to dull skin. Energy that had been suppressed for years began to resurface. Children started playing again. Adults stood straighter, moved quicker. It was like watching an entire pack remember what health felt like. On the morning of day 22, Arya prepared to return to Kingdom territory. Kira walked her to the border, accompanied by 5 wolves who'd volunteered to testify, witnesses to generations of systematic poisoning. The peace is formal as of now, Kira announced. No more raids. When you stand before the Elder Council, we'll stand with you. And Arya. She gripped the younger woman's shoulder. You survived this trial. You exposed those bastards. Because you've given my daughter a chance at a real life. I'll be damned if I let them take that away. News of the Ironwood peace reached the palace within hours. Arya felt it through the mate bond. Lucian's shock, his rage, his growing realization that she wasn't just surviving his impossible trial, but succeeding in ways he hadn't anticipated. The bond carried his turmoil like a storm, and for the first time, Arya sensed actual fear beneath his anger. She'd completed 2 impossible tasks. 8 days remained, and the entire kingdom was starting to pay attention. The summons came on day 23, delivered by a palace guard who looked distinctly uncomfortable with his assignment. Alpha King Lucian requests your presence. Immediately. Alone. Arya felt the command through the mate bond before the guard even finished speaking, a pulse so insistent it was almost painful. Lucian wanted to see her, and some primal part of their connection demanded she answer. She went, but on her terms, stopping by the Forgotten Archives first to leave a note for Theron. If I'm not back by dawn, assume the worst and get the evidence to the Elder Council. The palace felt different entering at this time. She'd walked these halls for 5 years as invisible staff, someone the nobles looked through rather than at. Now guards tracked her movement with wary eyes. Servants whispered as she passed. She'd become someone who mattered, and the shift was disorienting. They led her to the throne room, then retreated, closing the massive doors behind them with an echoing boom that sounded too much like a cell door slamming shut. The vast chamber was empty except for Lucian, standing at the base of the dais in casual clothing rather than his ceremonial armor. Somehow, that made him more intimidating. The deadly power barely contained beneath ordinary fabric. "You've been busy," he said without preamble. His ice-blue eyes tracked her approach like a predator watching prey. Shadowfen blooming, with impossible flowers. The Ironwood Pack suddenly declaring peace after decades of hostility. Common wolves gathering to watch you work like you're some kind of miracle worker. Quite the performance. "It's not a performance," Arya replied, stopping a careful distance away. The mate bond thrummed between them, electric and agonizing. "It's healing. The thing my bloodline was created to do before your father massacred us for it." Lucian's expression hardened. "Careful, Omega. Accusations against the crown are treason." "Is it treason if it's true?" Arya asked. She felt his rage spike through the bond, but underneath it was something else, something that felt like panic. "The poisoning, Lucian. Your father contaminating the water sources. Shadowfen being used as a disposal site. The Ironwood territory being turned into a dumping ground. My family discovering it and being murdered for threatening to expose it. How much of that did you actually know?" "You're spreading lies," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Using some kind of dark healing magic to manipulate witnesses, to make them see what you want them to see." "Dark magic?" Arya laughed, the sound sharp with disbelief. "I'm purifying poison from the earth. I'm healing land that's been deliberately contaminated. If that seems impossible to you, it's because you've spent your entire life believing the contamination was normal. You've lived in a poisoned kingdom so long you can't recognize what clean actually looks like." Lucian moved suddenly, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He grabbed her shoulders, not quite rough but not gentle either, and the mate bond flared so intensely at the contact that Arya gasped. "Stop," he commanded, and she didn't know if he meant stop talking or stop making him feel things he didn't want to feel. "You don't know what you're doing. You're destabilizing everything. The kingdom's order, the pack hierarchy, the very foundation of my authority." "Maybe your authority needs destabilizing," Arya shot back, refusing to flinch away. "If it's built on lies and mass poisoning, maybe it deserves to crumble." His hands tightened on her shoulders. Through their bond, through the physical contact, Arya's empathic abilities surged without her intending them to. She felt everything he was trying so desperately to suppress, the doubts that had been growing since she'd invoked the trial, the childhood memories of his father conducting mysterious meetings in locked rooms, the questions he'd learned not to ask because asking meant seeing things he didn't want to see. And deeper, more painful, the realization that had been clawing at him since the moment she'd started succeeding. That if she was right about the poisoning, about her family's innocence, about everything, then his entire identity was a lie. The rightful heir to a noble bloodline became the son of a mass murderer. The strong king protecting his people became the ruler perpetuating their oppression. Every moment of pride in his father's legacy transformed into complicity in atrocity. "You know," Arya whispered, seeing the truth written in his eyes. "Some part of you has always known something was wrong. You just chose not to look too closely because the alternative was too terrifying." Lucian released her like she'd burned him, stumbling backward.
"No.
My father was a strong king. He protected this kingdom from threats." "He created the threats," Arya interrupted. "He made the kingdom weak, so they'd need him. He poisoned his own people, so they'd be dependent on his strength. And you've been continuing it, haven't you? Maybe not actively. Maybe you're not the one ordering the contamination to continue, but you've been benefiting from it. From a population too weak to question, too sick to rebel, too dependent to demand better. Get out." His voice was dangerously quiet. "Not until you answer one question," Arya pressed, sensing she might never get this opportunity again. "When you rejected me in front of the entire kingdom, when you called my bloodline tainted by treason, did you actually believe it? Or were you just protecting your father's lies because the truth was too inconvenient?" The mate bond between them vibrated with tension, with Lucian's internal war made manifest. For one breathless moment, Arya thought he might crack, might finally admit what he'd been denying. She saw it flicker across his face, grief, guilt, the terrible burden of inherited evil. Then his expression went cold, deliberately shutting down every emotion. "If you continue spreading these lies," he said with icy precision, "I will declare your trial forfeit. You'll be exiled immediately, and any wolf who tries to speak on your behalf will be declared complicit in treason. The Ironwood Pack's peace will be revoked. The common wolves gathering at Shadowfen will be dispersed by force. Everything you've accomplished in the past 23 days will be erased, as if it never happened." Arya felt the threat through the bond. He meant every word. He would destroy everything she'd built, would bury the truth even deeper than his father had, would do anything to avoid facing what his legacy actually meant. "You're choosing this," she said, heartbreak mixing with anger. "You're actively choosing to protect lies over truth, to maintain poison over healing. And you'll have to live with that choice for the rest of your life." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or the ghost of the mate bond that should have made them partners, but instead had become a weapon. "I'm choosing to protect my kingdom from chaos. From an Omega with delusions of grandeur trying to overturn centuries of established order based on conspiracy theories and manipulation." "If that's what you need to tell yourself," Arya replied quietly. She turned toward the doors, then paused. "7 days left on my trial. You've stacked everything against me, impossible tasks, assassination attempts, threats of exile. But I'm going to complete the trial anyway. I'm going to stand before the Elder Council with evidence and witnesses. And when I do, you'll have a choice. Admit the truth and try to make amends, or double down on the lies and prove you're exactly the kind of king your father was." She walked toward the exit, feeling his gaze burning into her back. Just before she reached the doors, his voice stopped her.
"Arya."
It was the first time he'd said her name, really said it, without contempt or formal distance. Just her name, weighted with everything he couldn't say. She looked back. The mate bond pulsed between them, carrying the complexity of what they were to each other. Destined mates who'd become enemies, connected souls standing on opposite sides of a chasm built from lies and blood. "I wish." Lucian started, then stopped. His jaw clenched. "It doesn't matter. You have 7 days. Use them well." Arya left the throne room understanding something crucial. She couldn't save Lucian from his own choices. The mate bond didn't give her that power. She could offer truth, evidence, even empathy, but ultimately, he had to choose whether to face reality or hide from it. And right now, he was choosing denial with the desperate intensity of someone whose entire identity depended on it. She could only save the kingdom from the consequences of his choice, and pray that when she finally stood before everyone on day 30, the truth would be powerful enough to overcome even an Alpha King's willful blindness. As she walked back through the palace corridors, Arya felt the mate bond one more time, a pulse of conflict, of pain, of something that might have been regret. Then Lucian deliberately closed himself off, slamming barriers into place until their connection dulled to a distant ache. 7 days. One final impossible task to complete. And a king who'd just made it clear he'd rather destroy her than face what she represented. Arya squared her shoulders and headed back to the Forgotten Archives. She had evidence to compile, witnesses to prepare, and a kingdom to save, with or without its current ruler's cooperation. 3 days before the trial's conclusion, Arya and Theron worked through the night in the Forgotten Archives, transforming 15 years of hidden documentation into a presentation that could withstand scrutiny from the most hostile audience imaginable. The evidence spread across multiple tables formed an undeniable pattern. Water samples collected by Theron over decades, their toxin concentrations meticulously documented and preserved. Medical records showing the kingdom's population health declining in direct correlation with contamination increases. Archive documents bearing King Aldrich's personal seal ordering increased production of what he'd euphemistically labeled population management compounds. And the crown jewel, the original report written by Arya's mother and the other Moonstone healers, detailing their discovery of the poisoning with recommendations for immediate remediation. The report was dated 3 days before the massacre. "It's solid," Theron said, his weathered hands arranging the final documents with reverent care. "Anyone looking at this objectively would see the truth immediately. But we're not presenting to objective judges. We're presenting to people whose power depends on this truth staying buried." Arya sealed another water sample, this one showing the dramatic difference between contaminated and purified sources. "Then we make sure the presentation happens in front of enough witnesses that they can't suppress it afterward. The common wolves, the visiting alphas, the Ironwood delegation, everyone who's been gathering to watch this trial. If we die, at least the truth dies publicly." "Comforting," Theron muttered, but his eyes held something that looked like pride. "Your mother would have approved. She always said the truth deserved an audience, not a grave." They finished compiling just after midnight on day 28. 2 days remained before Arya would stand before the Elder Council and present her third impossible task, evidence of a service so valuable it outweighed her tainted bloodline. Evidence that would prove her bloodline had never been tainted at all, and the real traitors wore crowns. Arya returned to her cottage as dawn approached, exhausted but satisfied. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, she'd completed all 3 tasks. Shadowfen bloomed with moonflowers. The Ironwood Pack had declared peace. And the evidence that would expose a multi-generational conspiracy sat ready for presentation. She was preparing for a few hours of desperately needed sleep when she heard the knock. Quiet, almost hesitant. Her empathic senses painted a picture of conflict, fear, and determination before she even opened the door. Marcus, Lucian's beta, stood on her threshold looking like a man at war with himself. His usual cold composure had cracked, revealing someone much younger and more uncertain underneath. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble. "And you need to listen fast because I shouldn't be here." Arya let him in, noting how he kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected guards to materialize. He declined her offer to sit, instead pacing her small cottage like a caged animal. "The trial on day 30 is rigged," he said finally. "The Elder Council, Lucian spent the past week calling in favors, making threats, stacking it with loyalists. Magistrate Celine and 2 others might be impartial, but the rest will vote however he tells them to. Your evidence won't matter. They'll declare it falsified, manufactured by a desperate Omega trying to avoid exile." Arya's stomach dropped, though some part of her had expected this. And then Marcus stopped pacing, his expression grim. "Then they'll declare you guilty of treason for making false accusations against the crown. The sentence for treason is death, Arya. Immediate execution. You'll never leave that plaza alive." The words hung heavy in the small space. Arya thought about Shadowfen's blooming flowers, about the Ironwood wolves finally drinking clean water, about Theron's carefully preserved evidence that might die with her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. Marcus finally looked at her directly. "Because I've served Lucian for 8 years. I've watched him rule, watched him make decisions, watched him become more like his father with every passing season. And I've spent those 8 years noticing things I told myself didn't matter. Wolves getting weaker for no clear reason. Water that tasted wrong but that everyone else insisted was fine. Policies that seemed designed to keep the population dependent rather than strong." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and guilt warring in his expression. "I'm a beta. My entire purpose is loyalty to my alpha. But what do you do when your alpha is protecting evil? When loyalty to him means betraying everyone else?" I've been asking myself that question for years, and I've always chosen loyalty because it was easier. Because questioning meant facing things I didn't want to see. "And now?" Arya prompted. "Now I've watched you do impossible things. Heal land that every expert said was beyond redemption. Broker peace with wolves we've been fighting for 2 decades. Stand up to a king when any sane person would have just accepted rejection and disappeared." Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "You've proven that one person choosing courage over convenience can actually change things. And I'm tired of being someone who chose convenience." He pulled a small pouch from his jacket. "There's enough silver here to get you to the Southern Territories. New identity, new life. You leave tonight, you survive. The truth stays buried, but at least you're alive to maybe try again someday. Arya looked at the offered pouch, tempted for just a moment. Survival was appealing. Living to fight another day made strategic sense. But running meant everyone who'd supported her, Theron, the Ironwood Pack, the common wolves gathering hope from moonflowers, would face Lucian's retribution alone. And her family's sacrifice would mean nothing. No, she said firmly, pushing the pouch back toward Marcus. Running means the truth stays buried. My family died protecting this evidence. Wolves have suffered for generations under this poisoning. I won't let that continue, just to save my own life. Marcus stared at her like she'd grown a second head. He'll kill you. I'm telling you this explicitly. You show up on day 30, you die. Maybe, Arya agreed. Or maybe when I present evidence in front of thousands of witnesses, when the Ironwood Alpha testifies about the poisoning, when I show them moonflowers blooming in Shadowfen for the first time in 15 years, maybe some of those witnesses will question the official story. Maybe the truth spreads even if I don't survive to see it. She stepped closer, meeting his eyes with intensity. You came here offering me a choice, Marcus. Now I'm offering you one. You can keep choosing loyalty to a corrupt system because it's comfortable and safe. Or you can choose truth, knowing it's dangerous and will cost you everything. But understand, if you choose truth, you can't go halfway. You can't help me escape and tell yourself you did something noble while the poisoning continues. You have to be willing to stand up publicly and say what you know. Marcus's hands trembled slightly. If I testify against Lucian, against the Nightshade family, I'm marked for death. Every loyalty I've built, every bond I've honored, it all becomes treason. Yes, Arya said simply. That's what choosing truth costs. That's what my mother paid. That's what I'm about to pay. But the alternative is living the rest of your life knowing you protected evil because facing it was too scary. Is that really the beta you want to be? The silence stretched. Through her empathic abilities, Arya felt Marcus's internal battle, decades of conditioning toward absolute loyalty warring with emerging conscience, comfort fighting against integrity. She didn't push, didn't try to manipulate. This choice had to be his own, made freely, or it meant nothing. Finally, Marcus sank into the chair he'd refused earlier, looking suddenly exhausted. My father was a beta too. Served Aldrich before I served Lucian. He died when I was 16, sudden heart failure, the healers said. But I remember him in the weeks before, getting weaker, more tired. I remember him mentioning that the water tasted strange. And I remember Aldrich giving a very generous pension to my mother afterward, enough that she never had to work again. Understanding dawned cold and heavy. You think he was poisoned, that he noticed something wrong and they killed him for it. I think my father's loyalty was rewarded with murder disguised as natural causes, Marcus said, his voice hollow. And I've spent my adult life serving the family that probably killed him, telling myself it was honor when it was really just cowardice. He looked up at Arya, decision crystallizing in his eyes. If I testify, if I stand with you publicly, I need something in return. Not protection. I know I'm dead either way once I break loyalty. But I need you to make sure the truth about my father gets included. That wolves know he wasn't just another victim of mysterious weakness. He was murdered for noticing the truth. His name was Daniel. He deserves to be remembered as something other than Aldrich's loyal beta. Arya felt tears prick her eyes. I promise. When we expose this, your father's name will be honored alongside my family's. As someone who died protecting truth, even if he never got the chance to speak it. Marcus nodded slowly, then stood with new purpose. 2 days. I'll work on Magistrate Celine and the other impartial council members. Plant seeds of doubt. Make sure they actually look at your evidence instead of dismissing it automatically. And on day 30, when Lucian expects me to stand beside him. He paused. I'll stand with you instead. Let's make our deaths mean something. After Marcus left, Arya sat alone in her cottage watching dawn break over the kingdom. In 48 hours, she'd stand before everyone and present truth that would either transform the kingdom or get her executed. Possibly both. She felt the mate bond pulse with Lucian's distant presence. He was awake too, probably planning his own strategy for suppressing her evidence. They'd gone from destined mates to mortal enemies, and soon one of them would have to yield. Arya placed her hand over her heart where the bond burned constant and painful. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the connection, to the possibility of what they might have been if his father's evil hadn't poisoned everything. "But I can't save you from your choices. I can only make mine." 2 days until truth met power. 2 days until the kingdom discovered whether justice could triumph over corruption, or if evil protected by authority would win again. Arya intended to make those 2 days count. Day 30 dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter morning that felt like the world holding its breath. By the time Arya reached the Great Plaza, thousands had already gathered, more wolves than she'd ever seen assembled in one place. They filled every available space, spilling into side streets, climbing onto rooftops for better views. This wasn't just the nobility anymore. Common wolves, merchants, farmers, families who'd traveled from the kingdom's furthest reaches to witness what everyone sensed would be historic. A temporary throne had been erected on a raised platform at the plaza center, where Lucian sat in full ceremonial armor, the black and silver gleaming like a threat. The elder council flanked him in their formal robes, faces carefully neutral except for the ones Arya recognized as his loyalists. They looked smugly confident. Behind the platform, palace guards stood in formation, hands on weapons. The message was clear. This was Lucian's arena, and he controlled what happened here. Arya walked through the crowd wearing simple clothes, healer's red tunic and practical trousers, her dark hair braided back. No borrowed finery this time. She was done pretending to be anything other than what she was. The wolves parted for her, and she felt their hope like a physical weight. They'd been gathering at Shadowfen for weeks, watching moonflowers bloom, drinking water that tasted clean for the first time in their lives. They wanted to believe change was possible. She couldn't let them down. Magistrate Celine stood as Arya reached the platform. "Arya Moonstone, you stand before this council on the 30th day of your trial of worth. You were given 3 impossible tasks to prove your value to this kingdom. The time has come to present your results and face judgment." Arya climbed the platform steps, acutely aware of Lucian's ice-blue eyes tracking her every movement. The mate bond throbbed between them, but he'd locked it down tight, refusing to let her sense anything beyond surface rage. "The first task," Arya began, her voice carrying across the silent plaza, "was to heal Shadowfen Forest, land that had been barren for 15 years, that your best healers declared beyond redemption." She gestured, and several common wolves came forward carrying branches heavy with silver-white moonflowers. "Shadowfen blooms again. Anyone can visit and see for themselves. Life has returned to what was dead." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The loyalist council members exchanged glances, but couldn't dispute what hundreds had already witnessed. The second task was to negotiate peace with the Ironwood Pack. Wolves who've been raiding our borders for 20 years, who killed 3 previous negotiators. Arya turned as Alpha Kira stepped forward with her delegation, their presence among the crowd causing audible gasps. "The raids have ceased. A formal peace treaty has been signed. The Ironwood Pack stands here today not as enemies, but as allies willing to testify to truths this kingdom needs to hear." Lucian's hands gripped his throne's armrests hard enough that she heard the wood creak. But he hadn't interrupted yet, probably waiting for her to present the third task so he could spring whatever trap he'd prepared. "The third task," Arya continued, "was to present evidence of a service so valuable it outweighed my bloodline's supposed treason. I will do that now. But first, you all need to understand what my family actually discovered 15 years ago, and why they were murdered for it." She nodded to Theron, who emerged from the crowd carrying the wooden box of evidence. As he climbed the platform, several people recognized him, the former royal historian who'd disappeared decades ago. Shock registered on faces throughout the crowd. "That's enough." Lucian's voice cut through the plaza like a blade. He stood, alpha power radiating from him in waves that made weaker wolves cringe. This Omega has completed 2 tasks through manipulation and trickery, and now seeks to complete the 3rd through slander and fabrication. The documents she plans to present are falsified. The testimony she's gathered comes from discredited sources and enemies of the crown. I will not allow this platform to be used for spreading treasonous lies. Then let me show you something that can't be falsified, Arya interrupted, descending from the platform before the guards could stop her. She walked to the center of the great plaza, where the stones had been laid generations ago. Centuries of wolf traffic had worn them smooth, but Arya's heightened senses felt what lay beneath. Poisoned earth, toxic accumulation seeping up through cracks in the ancient paving. She knelt on the cold stone and pressed her palms flat against it. Then she opened herself completely to the lunar energy overhead, drawing it down through her body with every bit of power she'd awakened over the past month. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Silver-white light erupted from her hands, spreading across the plaza floor in branching patterns like lightning frozen in stone. The crowd gasped and stumbled backward as the light reached their feet. Arya felt the poison in the earth recognizing her power as its opposite, corruption meeting purification in a battle that made the ground itself tremble. The stones began to crack. Not destructively, but like something long contained was breaking free. Through the fissures, green shoots emerged, impossibly fast, growing and unfurling in seconds rather than seasons. And then, as thousands watched in stunned silence, moonflowers bloomed across the great plaza, silver-white petals opening to reveal luminescent centers, their scent washing over the crowd like a forgotten memory of what clean air should smell like. Arya gasped, the effort of such large-scale purification nearly overwhelming. But she held the connection. Let the transformation spread. Let everyone see with their own eyes as poisoned ground remembered what health felt like. This is what your kingdom has been for decades, she called out, her voice shaking but determined. Poisoned ground covered by pretty stones, contamination hidden beneath the surface. And these flowers? She gestured at the blooms spreading around her. These are moon blooms. They haven't grown wild in this kingdom for 15 years, since the Moonstone healers were massacred. Want to know why? Theron stepped forward, his voice carrying with surprising strength for someone so old. Because moon blooms purify toxins. Their roots clean contaminated soil and water. King Aldrich systematically eliminated them because they interfered with his poisoning program. And when the Moonstone healers discovered what he was doing and tried to cultivate moon blooms as remediation, he killed them too. He opened the wooden box, holding up documents. I have 15 years of evidence. Water samples, medical records, orders bearing Aldrich's seal. The previous king poisoned this kingdom deliberately to keep the population weak and dependent. The Moonstone family died heroes, trying to expose this conspiracy. Lies. Lucian roared, but his voice cracked slightly. Several loyalist council members stood to condemn the evidence, but then Marcus stepped forward, and the plaza fell absolutely silent. I'm Beta Marcus, he said, his voice steady despite visible fear. I've served Alpha King Lucian for 8 years, and his father before him. And I can confirm every word is true. I've watched this kingdom's health decline. I've noticed the chemical taste in our water that everyone pretends is normal. My own father died of mysterious weakness after mentioning concerns to King Aldrich. This conspiracy is real. It's been covered up for generations, and I will no longer be complicit in it. The crowd erupted. Questions, accusations, denials, and confirmations overlapping in a cacophony of voices. But then Alpha Kira's voice cut through the chaos. The Ironwood Pact confirms this testimony. Our territory has been poisoned worst of all, used as a dumping ground for contamination the kingdom couldn't hide elsewhere. We've been raiding not out of aggression, but desperation, trying to find resources clean enough to keep our children alive. This Omega healer, she gestured to Arya, gave us back our health in 3 days. 3 days of purification undid decades of systematic poisoning. That's the service her bloodline provides. That's what the Nightshade family killed to suppress. Lucian descended from the throne, his face twisted with desperate rage. You dare stand in my kingdom and accuse my family of... Your kingdom? Arya stood, moonflowers blooming at her feet. Look around, Lucian. This kingdom belongs to everyone suffering under the poison you've been too afraid to acknowledge. Your father was a monster, and you've been protecting his legacy because admitting the truth means admitting you've built your entire identity on a lie. He moved with alpha speed, crossing the distance between them before anyone could react. His hand closed around her throat, lifting her off the ground. The mate bond blazed with his pain and fury and terrible, crushing denial. Arya didn't fight, didn't struggle or strike back. Instead, she placed her hands on his armored chest and channeled every bit of healing power she had left directly into him. Not attacking, healing. She found the poisoning in his system, the contamination he'd been absorbing his entire life, and began purifying it. Found the fear and guilt he'd been suppressing for years, and offered understanding rather than judgment. The ground beneath Lucian's feet erupted with moonflowers, their light so bright it was almost blinding. The crowd watched as the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the kingdom, trembled while a dying Omega healed him. Through their bond, Arya felt the moment his denial finally shattered. Felt him remember things he'd forced himself to forget, his father's secret meetings, strange shipments to Shadowfen, whispered orders to eliminate anyone who asked too many questions. The truth he'd always known but refused to see crashed over him with devastating force. Lucian released her, stumbling backward. Arya collapsed to the ground gasping, but alive. The moonflowers continued spreading, transforming the great plaza into a garden of silver-white light. And in front of thousands of witnesses, Alpha King Lucian Nightshade fell to his knees and wept. The emergency council session lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony, evidence presentation, and the systematic dismantling of lies that had propped up a dynasty. Magistrate Celine led the proceedings with iron determination, refusing to let loyalist council members dismiss or deflect. The documents therein had preserved spoke for themselves, orders in Aldrich's own hand, systematic contamination records, financial transactions paying for silence. Combined with water samples, medical testimonies, and Marcus's insider account, the case became undeniable. On the 3rd day, the Elder Council delivered their verdict. The Nightshade family would be stripped of absolute authority. A reformed governing council would be established, including representatives from all ranks, alphas, betas, and for the first time in the kingdom's history, omegas. Lucian could remain as an alpha leader, but his power would be checked, his decisions subject to council approval, his family's crimes formally acknowledged in the historical record. Arya watched from the public gallery as Lucian accepted the terms, his face carved from stone, revealing nothing. But through the mate bond that still connected them, she felt his agony. The grief of watching his father's legacy exposed as monstrous, the shame of his own complicity through willful blindness, the loss of an identity he'd built his entire life around. She felt it all, and despite everything, some part of her ached for him. That was why, on the 7th day after the trial, she sought out an elder priestess who specialized in bond ceremonies. The woman lived in a cottage at the kingdom's edge, ancient enough to remember when moonblooms grew everywhere and moonstone healers were honored rather than feared. "You want to sever a mate bond," the priestess said, not a question. Her milky eyes somehow saw more than most wolves with perfect vision. A sacred connection decreed by the moon goddess herself. A connection built on rejection, lies, and pain, Arya corrected gently. Whatever the goddess intended for us, it's been poisoned too thoroughly to heal. I need to be free of it. He needs to be free of it. The ceremony was private, conducted under the full moon with only the priestess present. Arya knelt on earth she'd already purified, surrounded by moonflowers, and spoke the words that would cut the silver cord connecting her heart to Lucian's. It hurt, moon goddess. It hurt worse than anything physical she'd endured, like tearing out a piece of her own soul. Through the bond's final moments, she felt Lucian somewhere in the palace, gasping as if struck, feeling the severance from his end. Then it was done. The constant ache in her chest, the awareness of his presence like a compass pointing north, the unwanted intimacy of feeling his moods and conflicts, All of it vanished, leaving behind only profound silence. Arya took her first breath as a truly unbound wolf and felt lighter than she had in months. The Elder Council granted her claim to the Moonstone ancestral lands, 20 acres of rich soil in the kingdom's western territory that had been seized after the massacre and left unused for 15 years. Arya stood at its center and felt her grandmother's bones in this earth, her mother's last stand on this ground. She knelt and pressed her palms to soil that remembered her bloodline, and when she opened herself to lunar energy this time, the response was immediate and joyful. The land welcomed her home. Within a month, she'd established the Moonstone Sanctuary. The main building was a healing center where any wolf, regardless of rank, could receive treatment without payment. Beside it, she built a training academy where young healers, especially Omegas whose gifts had been suppressed or dismissed, could learn to develop their abilities fully. And surrounding it all, she cultivated gardens of moonflowers whose roots spread purification through the soil and whose presence reminded everyone that health was possible, that what had been lost could be reclaimed. 6 months after the trial, Arya stood in her sanctuary's main courtyard watching the transformation with quiet satisfaction. The kingdom was changing, slowly but undeniably. Poison water sources were being purified, one by one, through methods she taught to teams of trained healers. Omega rights were being codified into law, no more casual dismissal, no more assumption of lesser worth. Medical centers reported a dramatic decrease in the mysterious weakness that had plagued the population for decades. Wolves were remembering what true health felt like. The sanctuary itself had become a symbol. Wolves traveled from across the kingdom to see the moonflower gardens, to drink water that tasted clean, to witness proof that systematic corruption could be exposed and overcome. More importantly, young wolves were arriving weekly asking to train as healers, wanting to learn the moonstone techniques, desperate to help their communities recover from generations of poisoning. Arya's current class consisted of 12 students, ranging from 16 to 40 years old, all showing varying degrees of empathic healing ability. They gathered in the courtyard each evening as the moon rose, and tonight Arya was teaching them the fundamental frequency technique, the humming vibration that could neutralize toxins at their source. Remember, she told them, walking among their seated forms, healing isn't about forcing change through brute power. It's about understanding corruption's frequency and offering an alternative. Transform, don't fight. Make space for what's healthy to return, rather than just destroying what's sick. A young Omega woman, barely 18, raised her hand hesitantly. But what if the sickness is strong? What if it doesn't want to be transformed? Arya smiled gently. Then you be stronger. Not through force, but through persistence, patience, and absolute certainty in your own worth. The poison in this kingdom thrived because wolves believed they were naturally weak, that sickness was normal. Once you know you deserve health, once you remember what strength actually feels like, transformation becomes inevitable. After the class ended, Arya remained in the courtyard under the full moon, surrounded by her grandmother's silver flowers. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from invisible palace healer to rejected mate to revolutionary who'd helped topple a dynasty built on lies. It felt simultaneously like a lifetime ago and just yesterday. A messenger appeared at the sanctuary gates, a young wolf bearing the formal seal of the Reformed Council. He approached cautiously, offering a sealed letter. From Alpha Lucian, miss. He asked that I deliver it personally. Arya took the letter but didn't open it immediately. She'd heard about Lucian's work over the past months, how he'd been personally overseeing the contamination cleanup, how he'd opened the palace archives to public scrutiny, how he'd been meeting with common wolves to hear their stories of sickness and loss. He was trying, in his own way, to atone for inherited evil and his own complicity. She respected that, even if she couldn't forgive it yet. She waited until the messenger left before breaking the seal. The letter was short, written in Lucian's precise handwriting. You were right. I'm sorry. For everything. L. Arya read it twice, feeling the weight of those simple words, the vulnerability it must have taken to write them. Part of her wanted to respond, to acknowledge his effort, to offer some path toward reconciliation. But the larger, wiser part knew better. Some bonds, once broken, should stay that way. Not out of cruelty, but out of recognition that some wounds heal better with distance. She took the letter to the courtyard's central fire and dropped it in, watching the paper curl and blacken and disappear into ash. Not out of anger, she'd moved past that months ago, but out of completion. That chapter of her life was finished. What came next belonged to her alone. Under the full moon, surrounded by moonflowers and the distant sounds of her students practicing healing frequencies, Arya felt something she'd never experienced before. Peace. Not the fragile peace of someone waiting for the next disaster, but the solid, grounded peace of someone who'd faced the worst and emerged transformed rather than broken. She thought about that Omega woman in her class, barely 18, still carrying the internalized belief that her gifts were weakness rather than strength. Arya had been that woman once, convinced her worth depended on others' recognition, that service was the only path to belonging. She understood now that she'd had it backward all along. Tomorrow, she'd continue the work. More contaminated sites to purify, more students to train, more wolves to teach that systematic oppression thrived on their silence and collapsed under their collective voice. The kingdom's transformation was far from complete, but it had begun, and that beginning was proof that change was possible when someone chose courage over comfort. Arya walked to the sanctuary's edge, where she could see the kingdom spread below. Lights in windows, smoke from chimneys, lives being lived in increasing health and hope. Somewhere out there, Lucian was doing his own work of atonement. Maybe someday their paths would cross again as equals, as leaders working toward the same goal from different positions. Maybe not. Either way, she'd be fine. Because Arya Moonstone had learned the most important lesson of all. Your worth was never determined by those who rejected you. It was always within you, waiting for you to be brave enough to claim it. And once claimed, once truly understood, it became unshakable, a foundation upon which entire revolutions could be built. The moon rose higher, full and bright, blessing the sanctuary and the kingdom beyond with silver light. And in that light, moonflowers bloomed across lands that had been barren for decades, proof that even the most poisoned ground could remember how to flourish when someone finally chose healing over harm.